Welcome to Tech Tuesday number 49. And today we're going to talk about time and IP, and in particular, is it okay to wait with dealing with IP? But first, we're going to take a moment of silence, respect of about 100 hostages that are still out there somewhere. I'm going to start with two old riddles that are probably familiar. I can never be seen, but I can be felt. I never wait, but I always cost. And also from The Hobbit. This thing all things devours, gnaws iron, slays kings, and so on. Now we know that the answer is time. And being patent attorneys, we're very aware of time, or at least a date, and we're especially aware of deadlines. And Douglas Adams had a saying, which we're absolutely not allowed to agree with, that he loves deadlines because he loves the whooshing sound they make when they go by. So, what I want to talk about today is that time in IP, and especially in patents, is much more than deadlines and that patents expire after 20 years. It's much more than that. And where did this all start? Often clients say, well, maybe we'll wait with IP. We'll wait with dealing with IP. And we always say, no, no, don't wait. We have to do it now. But the question is, how bad is it? Maybe it's good if you wait with IP. So in order to answer that question, I realize we have to go into the whole issue of what is a time in IP. When we know that everything in IP depends on time and also changes over time. I've previously given a talk about focused on the subject of time windows. And if we talk about a time window, you can often tell when filing an application is at issue that you can file the application too early or you can file it too late. That doesn't tell us much about dealing with the IP portfolio, and it doesn't tell us much in general about IP management. What we can agree is that time is a critical dimension in IP. So I have here a few quotes about time. Top of the page is from Einstein, and the second one, that time is so everything doesn't happen at once. And anybody who's filed an application 3 days before the competitor or 3 days after the competitor knows what I'm talking about. And if anybody wonders what happens if two people file on the same day, the answer is it depends on the country, but it's exciting. Anybody reading the news knows Lenin's quote, the decades when nothing happened, there's weeks when decades happen. Last week, decades happened around here, next week as well. But what I want to talk about is how time guides IP and how IP is used to shape time. Now, a patent attorney that I'm going to keep anonymous talked to me about the trap of 5 times. Okay, the patent attorney said, I can only think about 5 times. Long time ago, yesterday, right now, tomorrow, and the far future. Okay, and it comes from working with deadlines. Now, I'm calling it a trap because, as we're going to see in a minute, the actual time scales you have in IP don't fit neatly into these five categories. And if you're used to working in these five categories, you're probably not handling time correctly. Stuart Brand and, I forget his name, um, put out this very nice chart which talks about how quickly things change. Nature changes slowly, culture a bit faster, governance faster, infrastructure faster, commerce even faster, and fashion even faster. With the idea being that you should always be asking, which layer am I working in? And a question that I'm not going to answer because I don't have a final answer is, what layers should you be considering for IP? What changes more quickly, what changes more slowly? Uh, what about layers for business? Some people have written about it, but not convincing enough in my mind. What is for sure is that the layers depend on the technology and on the market that you're talking about. So let's start with what's easy. Linear time for IP. Easiest is what I call micro scale. You measure it in days or weeks. How long does it take to draft something? How long does it take to get feedback? How long does it take to understand an invention and complete the details? If it's a client to complete the details, yes, I know it can take months, but more likely days and weeks is the right number. Office time, I mean patent office, of course. It's usually months. You have 1 month to respond, 2 months to respond, 3 months, 5 months. In rare cases, 30 days. It used to be you had some dates that were 15 days, but it's really measured in months. You have patent time. The phases of a life of a patent are usually years long. There's trade secret time. If you look at the time scales that a trade secret cares about, so that's more complicated. It's days, months, and years. The value of a trade secret goes down with time, basically years. An NDA term is usually in years. The time it takes for something to leak can be measured in days. And the time it takes somebody to reinvent what you have a trade secret on is usually measured in months. Now, I'm giving you all of these different times because I believe you should be aware of them and be considering them when you do your job. Law time. How long does it take the law to change? Years and decades. But law can also change if a Supreme Court puts down a decision which says Alice, okay? And since we're in international practice, it can happen anywhere in the world at any time. And last but not least, experience time. Okay, it takes time to get experience to deal with IP. So the client, the patent attorney, and the examiner. These, of course, measured in years or decades if you're old enough. But a lot of important times are not directly about IP. Okay, so anything about R&D cycles, how long a fashion lasts, how long regulatory authority takes, marketing, sales, how long it takes to build a factory or to build a distribution system, how long will it take for a competitor to exist, how long will it take a competitor to catch up. These are all timescales you have to think about. Technology, will a new technology that avoids your IP come about, or maybe the technology you're planning on? How long will it take it to exist, to affect your sales, to be common? So these are linear times, and each one is measured differently, days, months, years, but you have to be aware of them. But chronos is basically linear time, okay, clock time. But there's also Kairos times and perhaps other times as well. So Kairos time from ancient Greek, when they talked about an event whose time had come. So event, each event generates its own little time scale. How long does it take to respond? Mind time. How long does it take you to overcome the shock that this event happened? How long does it take you to learn about what it means? So how does this come about? We can't predict when a discovery will happen, but we can often say what's the timeline of unrolling of events will be after that event happens. Stage time. Companies grow, they change from one state to the next, and each one has its own natural time regime, which I'll talk about in a few slides. Uh, Phase time. Here we don't talk about how long, whatever. We only ask, are we doing it before, during, or after the time marker? Are we filing the application before we publish, on the day of publication, or after publication? And you can also have a phase compared to the competition or some other informational triggers. Are we filing before the competition or after the competition? There are also rhythms, which can be natural or not. Seasons, yearly conferences. If there's a yearly conference in the field of cosmetic surgery, I know there's many more than one, then it's probably better to file whatever you want to file before the conference when lots of things are going to be published rather than after. We don't talk about it so much, but there's an issue of frequency. We file 2 new patent applications every year. Okay? It's not measured by time, it's measured by how often we do something. Now, I'm not going to talk today about prediction. I have a completely different talk about it. But what I do want to say is it's a shape of the future. How many possibilities are unfolding and how broad can the unfolding be? It changes how time interacts with them. And one last issue about time. Anybody who's been in the military, my uncle who served in Korea said, the military is all about hurry up and wait. So also in IP, for any particular client, for any particular file, we're usually in the wait mode, and then suddenly there's a hurry up mode. So the time is really not perceived linearly. Okay, so we talked about time and time and time. Very closely related to time is a concept of tempo, and Venkatesh Rao wrote a book about it, an accessible book, I should say. And tempo is really the rhythm of making decisions, or in our case, of taking actions. Okay, so if you think about a classic invention, we invent it, we file it, then a year later we file PCT, then half a year later it publishes, then another year later we file national phase. Okay, that's a very clear tempo when decisions have to be made. Now, IP definitely has its own tempo, but the IP tempo does not stand alone. It can't be disconnected from anything else. It should obviously match other tempos like marketing. If marketing comes out with a new marketing scheme every 6 months, or a marketing campaign every 6 months, then you probably should not be filing every 9 months. Okay, your tempo should be matching what the marketing is doing, and of course, be a little bit before it. And I've also talked about previously how R&D and IP often act as a single unit. So when you talk about the IP tempo, you absolutely cannot ignore the tempo of R&D. Tempo is often relative. For example, not only inside the company, but also outside the company. The tempo at which we file IP should often be connected to the tempo of the R&D of your competitors. If your competitors come out with a new product every 9 months, then you shouldn't be filing new IP every 2 years. There's something wrong happening here. Startup companies have a fast tempo, but it often varies. Suddenly you run out of money, everything slows down. Suddenly you have a big investor or um, sales opportunity, everything speeds up, and the IP has to match that. And so the first question we ask ourselves, who is setting the tempo of IP activity in the company that we're handling? And the people who are setting it, are they aware of the various IP timescales? And the next question is, to the patent attorney, do you know what the tempo is of all of these outside players like competitors, markets, technology, investors, okay? How long does it take an investment to happen? What does it look like, this event? Okay, it has its own tempo. I mentioned before temporal regime. So time does not run uniformly over a company's life. And sometimes you can divide a company into stages and say we have the stage where we're rushing to have a proof of concept. We have a different stage where we're looking for product market fit, and we have another stage where we found it, and now we're doing scaling. So obviously each one needs different IP, but the time, the tempo is different in each one of these stages. And also your competitors and your market and the relationships inside the outside ecosystem also have different natural time regimes. Okay, if your competitor just got a lot of money, the tempo is going to change. So just as an example, the kind of patents you write when you're trying to build a proof of concept is very different from the kind of patents or maybe trade secrets that you need to have when you're scaling. The amount of protection that you have, it's not IP, is also different. The type of risks that you have at these different chain stages, guess what, is also different. The goals of the company absolutely are changing. And if your IP is somehow aligned with the goals of the company, which of course it should be, you have to be aware of it. So the next question to us patent attorneys, do we know what stage the company is at and what the temporal regime is? And here I'm giving a warning. You might have heard the phrase reality distortion field, and it's believed that some magical founders, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, distort reality wherever they are. And one of the things they distort is time, and especially perceived time. So you have to be super aware of it. Speaking of perceived time, there's times it's actually happening, and there's a time that we believe is happening, and both of them need to be considered. First, let's talk about a particular type of time. We've mentioned worldly maps before. The y-axis, if you can see here, starts from Genesis, custom built, product, and commodity. And what he's saying is that when a new technology is developed, it goes through a commoditization process. There could be other progressions. And he's not saying how long it's going to take to get from the left side to the right side, but it's moving in that direction. So wherever you are, you can ask yourself, how quickly is it moving? And one of the memes out there is that adoption rates of new technology and new products are moving much faster today than they did in the past. And that, of course, affects, what kind of IP you need and when you're going to need that IP and so on. And classic way of doing it, look at this chart on the bottom right, compares ChatGPT to other software technologies. And look, it took Netflix 1,300 days in order to reach 1 million users, and ChatGPT, a week, 2 weeks, some funny number. So when you see this, you say, wow, things are changing. But if you read the paper over here, you'll see that it's not so. And just to give you an example, look at the rate of adaptation of the radio, okay, 80 years ago, and compare to the rate of adaptation of the internet. I'm sorry, it's not 80 years ago, it's 100 years ago. And this one is 30 years ago. It's very similar. Okay, look how quickly color TV was adopted. Look how slowly washing machines were adopted. So it's a very interesting paper which is saying that there are a lot of things that affect adaptation, and the fact that we're in the 21st century is one of them, but not the major one. Okay, so we have all of these times and tempos happening there. How does IP affect them? So first, in case anybody is not aware, IP is about time control. Few examples: extensions of time, patent term extension or adjustment, buying options like using the path convention or the PCT, divisional and continuation practice, all sorts of methods of hacking the prosecution practice. I'm not going to go into detail, but a lot of them have to do with making it slower, making it faster, waiting until we know what we want to do, and so on. And of course, since it's something that patent attorneys like to do, there's pushback from the patent office and from the various lawmakers which try to prevent us from playing around with time. Each country in its own annoying little way. IP, if you use it to delay a competitor, you can definitely affect the tempo at which they work. Depending on how you control time, you can swap cheap time for expensive time. Okay? Often the value of a patent in 20 years is lower than it is now. Let's say if you want to get an investment. So maybe you speed up the acceptance of the patent. If you're in pharma, of course, it's exactly the opposite. The classical example, which we wish clients would do more, is delaying activities until they actually have the IP rights to protect them. Can you use IP to control tempo? So I give a few examples, but the real question I'm wondering has to do with psychological state. And I've said before, but I'm now raising it as a question. If IP is slow and us practitioners have time to assimilate changes and think about them and not be psychologically surprised, does that mean that some of the effect, which we'll talk about in a minute, of playing with tempo can't be provided? So I say it, I think I believe it, but I'm not sure anymore after preparing this presentation that it's actually correct. Here I tried to give a list of, remember the original question was, should we wait with IP? Now I made a table. Everything in the table is context sensitive. The intensity of the effect, how sensitive the effect is to small changes. But in general, if you wait, the novelty of your invention is going to go down because other people might invent it, more prior art will come out. You might invent more things, but also your competition. On the other hand, enablement will go up. Innovation, bringing things to the market will go up. Opportunity often will go up because the more there is, the more there's opportunity. Clarity of what it is that you want will definitely go up. The maturity of the technology and maybe some stability in designs is going to go up. The community is going to be better. The risk of somebody replacing you or of the whole technology being replaced also goes up. And of course, your competition, the risk of there being a competition will go up. And last but not least, if you wait with building moats, you wait long enough and you don't have any moats left. And this is not an answer to the question, but it helps understand a little bit about the relationship between first movers, that I'm going to be the first guy in the market, and IP. And one of the things that you have to ask yourself, do I wait or don't I wait, is am I going to be a first mover or am I going to be a follower? Where's my biggest problem? If my biggest problem is enablement, maybe I should wait. If my biggest problem is clarity, maybe I should wait. If my biggest problem is competition, maybe I shouldn't wait. Hopefully it helps answers the question. Time can also be a source for BI, business intelligence. If I look at a company and I look at what the IP activity looks like, and here's a chart that talk about the number of companies in the field versus the number of patents applied for in the field. And I'm not going to go into this, but basically, if you look at these charts, they show you something's happening. There are more and more companies, and the number of filing goes down, then it can go up again, and you can map it to stages of the field. Okay, there's quite a bit of work on this type of analysis, but what you see here is by looking at the tempo of filings, I can see where the market is. Same thing with a startup company. The normative ways of doing IP, I'm not saying they're the best way, but the normative ways, and by looking at the IP behavior of a company, you can learn quite a bit about their state. And also you can learn about whether they have an IP weakness, which is starting to happen, and also how good they are at using IP. What you can't know is what they're doing about trade secrets. But if you know the state of the company, you can often estimate how many trade secrets and how much know-how they're creating and how valuable it might be. You don't know, but you can estimate. Of course, if people are looking at you, you can pretend to do something else, and you can pretend using IP. You can definitely pretend to have not finished R&D by filing more patent applications, which in a way that shows that you haven't finished IP. And if there is a norm, and hopefully you're aware of it, the question is your company acting according to the norm? And if it's not, or if it is, why? Is it intentional or unintentional? So let's say we did everything, we control time, and now we have spare time. What are we going to do with it? One thing we can definitely do is learn, okay? If we work with startup companies, everything is new. We have a lot to learn. We can use that time in order to learn the company's inventions and so on. We can use the time to look at our competitors, to look how law is evolving, look how technology is changing. We can make plans. And the reason for this slide actually is we can test our strategy. Okay, so we built this wonderful, incredible IP strategy, whatever that is. And if you read this post by Irrational Exuberance, he's talking about testing his engineering strategy, but it applies just as well to IP strategy. And you can ask yourself, will I use this time to see if my strategy is working? Will I use this time to see if my particular IP components are working? And you ask yourself, am I going to check this using a stress test, do a search for prior art, or using QA methods? In addition, of course, you use the time to improve what you have and to do other IP activities. And if you have time, you use it to solve cash flow problems and business risks. And most important, something Panatonics don't like doing, you can wait. I can wait for the law to change. I can wait for IP of our competitors to be challenged, not by me, by somebody else. I don't have to be part of it. Okay, if I have the time, I should use it. You're probably familiar with the word narrative, probably in a derogatory sense when somebody talks about newspapers generating a narrative, which has nothing to do with reality. But we've talked about it before that if you want to arrange a lot of facts together in some way, one of the ways that we as humans do it is make a narrative. And your company has a narrative, and the IP of the company has a narrative. In fact, some people say not what I'm writing here, that narrative is a way of explaining strategy, but perhaps strategy should be defined as a narrative. In any case, if you have a narrative, it should talk about time. And here I'm giving you an example of a narrative. We've talked about the Kunfin framework, which has different states of the world. It can be clear, it can be complicated, it can be complex, it can be chaotic. And without going into all of the detail, if you look at the blue part, it says, how do you act? So when you're clear, you do sense, categorize, respond. But when it's chaotic, you do act, sense, respond. A lot of startup companies start in the chaotic state and they go clockwise to get to the clear state. Okay, that's a narrative. The company is at different stages. And at each one of these stages, the type of IP, but also the timing regime and the tempo has to be different because if you're in an act mode, you're acting before you filed your IP. If you're in the probe mode, maybe you're filing IP, but you have to wait to get some sort of feedback from IP. That takes time. In any case, this is an IP narrative. My company is going to be here, and then it's going to be here, and then it's going to be here, and it's going to be about a year over here, and then 2 years here. And that's why my IP, I'm going to do more filings of this type here. Here, I'm going to collect trade secrets, and so on and so forth. I have a whole talk about time windows, cute quote from Julius Caesar. And in the presentation about time windows, I talk about identifying windows where IP can be used. But you also need to identify time windows when your IP will be available or when you're going to have a particular vulnerability. If I'm planning on talking to my uh, potential competitor, potential strategic partner in 2 years, so that opens a time window for when I need to be protected against the vulnerability of my potential competitor partner stealing my ideas and doing them without me. And windows are also geographical, of course. Mhm. If you know what the windows are of your competitions, especially as they relate to making decisions and making plans, then you can definitely time your IP to hit them right in the window. We talked about shifting the windows using IP or using other activities. A classic activity is launching sooner or launching later. We can time IP to the window. If I'm about to have an investment, I make sure I get lots of grants before the investment to show that my IP portfolio is real and not just, applications. If I have a competitor partner who has to decide whether to buy my company or compete with my company, maybe I should make sure to publish my IP position before they need to make that decision. And one last thing you can do with windows, besides shifting, I can narrow them for competitors. If you file an opposition, if you make a publication, if you threaten somebody with a legal action, they change the windows where they can act. I talked earlier about tempo. The classic example of tempo has to do with OODA loop, which says you observe, orient, decide, and act. Doesn't really matter if This works, but a lot of people do believe that it works. And why am I saying that? Because when you talk about IP, you it's probably difficult to interfere with the decision making of your competitor as well as we can in real time. But what we can do is if we have a competitor, and every time the competitor does something, a patent of ours publishes which says the competitor is infringing. So the competitor now has to make changes. And as soon as they make a change, another patent publishes. After it happens a few times, the competitor is completely out of whack. All of the decision-making processes inside the company are screwed up, and we win. And this is perhaps an example of the Chinese stratagem of replace the beams and pillars with rod and timber. If you're interested. In any case, what you definitely want to be doing is you want to file your IP before your competition files, or before your competition chooses a direction to go, or after they're committed to a direction, you want to make sure your IP publishes. And a particular type of IP, which in the past at least, Boston Scientific used to do a lot, I call it nail in the wall. There's, an old story about a guy who sold his house, except for the nail in the wall. And then he would, after he sold his house, he would come visit his nail to make sure it's okay. And he'd come and shine it up. And the person who bought the house couldn't handle it anymore because he kept on being interrupted. And he sold the house back for half price. So what Boston Scientific used to do, they used to file a lot of general patents. And in fact, whenever a client came with a new idea and we do a search, we would find that Boston Scientific had a general patent or application or granted patent in that field, which was stuck right in the middle of what we wanted to do, even if it was relatively narrow. Okay? And I'm not going to comment why they might have done it, but it was definitely contaminating IP. And they definitely filed it before these clients existed because the clients walked in 4 years after the filing and they had just had the idea yesterday. Like I said, it happened more than once. Timing can definitely be used for cost control. The best way is you buy an option to later do something. It's very cheap by filing IP. PCT, we all know about. You do IP analysis on time, helps you avoid big mistakes later. You might be familiar with the distinction between working in a business and working on a business. When you're working in the business, you're solving things that give you money. When you work on the business, you add value to the company. But what's nice about IP is that while the people are working in the business, they're generating IP, which adds value to the business. And one of the interesting ways of using timing for cost control is when you need an IP portfolio quickly, you can file multiple applications with requests for expedited procedure. But while you don't have money, you wait and you don't do it. So you can use timing in order to simultaneously get a big IP portfolio when you need it and not spend money when you don't need it, as in before. Let's get back to the question that I started with. Is it okay to wait with thinking about your IP? Okay. So I broke it down into a few different components. One is IP analysis. So I believe IP should be considered on day zero because it can help you with business planning, can help you with educating the executives. But after you do the analysis, perhaps you're not going to do any activity at all. Now, analysis is not yet strategy. If you believe that IP strategy has to be aligned with company strategy, well, guess what? If there's no company strategy, you can't have IP strategy. Maybe you can use it to convince them they need it, but that's all. But you still have some sort of generic strategy that you're filing, like file patents on the technology, and you absolutely have to review the issue all the time. One of the things your IP strategy will do, it will say, how much clarity do we need in order to decide to do certain IP activities like filing a patent? And unlike IP outside activities, IP policies, I believe, should be set as early as possible. So don't delay thinking about IP. Do it more than once, but it could be that the actual effort and cost in dealing with IP will be low at the beginning. What about IP actions? It's complicated, but here's a few tips. First of all, for patents, how about you make sure your trade secret policy is in place first? Because anything that you're not filing a patent on is a secret until then. Trademarks definitely have deadline times that if you don't deal with it properly, your company could be dead. Freedom to operate. The delaying has nothing to do with you and everything to do with your IP vulnerabilities and your desire to reduce them. In general, when you do IP actions, well, guess what? You have a strategy. Follow it. But consider enablement. Consider events which force your hands, like publications at, conferences, not having money. And there's all these risks, like somebody coming before you, missing an opportunity, the idea leaking out. So I'm not giving an answer on how much you can delay, but I'm not just saying it depends. I'm hopefully telling you what it depends on. One last thing about time. Next to last thing. If you have a race with your competitor, here's a giraffe and you have the zebra coming up from behind. Is it a sprint or is it a marathon? Sometimes it takes, 5 years to bring a product to the market. And I list here all sorts of tactics which you can definitely use IP in order to slow down your competitors while you're racing. Example, if you're familiar with three golden apples, you can use golden apples to slow down your competition, and I've seen it done. Or you can place mines for them to step on. You can change the goalpost using IP. You can convince your competitor to block the rest of the competition. You can use your IP to stop them. And if you have a race, I'm sure you know why you're going to win and you know why your IP is going to help you. And different type of strategy, we mentioned first mover, fast follower, takeover guy, parasite, bottom feeder. Each one of these is a different company strategy for dealing in the market. And each one needs a different IP strategy because it defines a different race. Just for example, if you're a parasite, there has to be somebody to be a parasite on. So you're probably going to wait. Yes, the waiting is a virtue. Knowing how long to wait turns it into an advantage. Usually waiting too long is bad. The issue of time is not only an IP issue, it's an IP portfolio issue. If the only thing you take home from here is avoiding the now trap, it's either now or forever, I've done it. And the biggest timing mistake so far is publishing before filing. Biggest typical one. So try to avoid making a timing mistake bigger than that. In any case, in order to give an example for all of these timing issues, I asked ChatGPT to give me a story. And surprisingly, it gave a very nice story. When you file patents in the world of the Time Lords, you have multiple timelines. And time itself was the enemy, and that is absolutely true for patent attorneys in general. And The question is, what should you do? And they decided that delay was a double-edged sword. Absolutely. And they decided to use a combination of patents and trade secrets. Absolutely. And notice the use of delayed disclosure and the idea of using adaptive filings, matching your tempo to the tempo of others. They're filing, so we're filing. Keep it critical trade secrets. And yes, strategic delay requires careful navigation. And guess what? The competition, they filed a patent too quickly and it had flaws and they didn't get protection. So I'm incapable of answering this question, but maybe you can. What would you have done differently? And might you have failed? And most important, is this strategy a robust strategy, meaning that if the world changes a bit, it's still good? Or is it fragile? I'm stopping the recording now.